Do you want to live in a world that's ruled by Darwin's survival of the fittest? If I need to compete for a job, am I going to slash Mike Flattery's tires? Or am I going to slip some sleeping pills into Roxanne's coffee so that she misses the interview? No, I'm going to compete by improving myself, to use the resources that are available to me for a more productive purpose. That's how I'm going to compete in my environment. Why don't I compete like Darwin says I should, by hurting other people? Well, that's because Darwin's theory only works in an environment where we have limited resources, in a zero-sum game, which means that if I win, you lose. I survive, you die. That's a zero-sum. If there's enough for both of us, there's no problem. The prize must be survival, and the loser does not get the opportunity to reproduce. That's the purpose. So if I disable the competition over a Toastmasters contest, that might be important to me, but nobody dies. We both have the opportunity to reproduce, even if we don't. Through Darwin's survival of the fittest, we have adapted to our environment to conserve our resources, to increase our advantage over members of our own species and over other species as well, to become more fit. We are now at the pinnacle of the evolutionary woodpile, the king of the hill, so to speak, because we have essentially exempted ourselves from the survival of the fittest in the rawest sense. So how does Darwin's theory explain Hitler and Stalin and Saddam Hussein? Well, how does Darwin's theory explain Mother Teresa, or the Boy Scouts, or Greenpeace, or Toastmasters? We have to consider both. Because science, the fact is that Darwin does not even address evil. Science does not address good or evil in any way. Science is neutral. Science doesn't kill people. People kill people. Thousands of years ago, there was no evidence that the earth had ever changed, and so everybody believed that it would always be the same. And it was natural to believe that it must have just happened, spontaneously created in its present form, and that it would never change. And this went undisputed for centuries because no one had a better explanation. Now remember, Darwin did not invent evolution any more than Isaac Newton invented gravity. And Galileo did not invent the fact that the earth went around the sun instead of the other way around. However, these men were persecuted for opposing popular views that were the popular doctrine that the discoveries contradicted. They were persecuted for this heresy, actually. All of these scientists were critically aware of their world and observed natural phenomena that could not be ignored and came to inescapable conclusions that contradicted the popular common sense that was tried to suppress. We now know better now. Although we really still don't know how evolution works, we don't know how gravity works, but we do use this information every day. Interestingly, Darwin theorized 100 years before we actually discovered it, that there was some little something that passed information from one generation to the next. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he could not explain his observations or those of Lamarck and other scientists before him in any other way. Darwin was right about it too, and we now know that there is a unique blueprint. We each have a unique blueprint, the gene, that produces a copy of itself, each slightly different from its parents in a very predictable way, exactly the way Darwin had predicted 100 years before. Importantly, there was no sinister intent when Darwin simply observed that the gradual changes and differences between species belied the popular view. and that so many similar insects, plants, and animals might not be spontaneously created. Emphasis might not be, but were generational adaptations. Over several years, Darwin observed species that made gradual changes into new species during short enough periods and in controlled enough environments that there was no other way to explain it than the survival of the fittest. These species had adapted to the environment with very limited resources that showed that these traits made them fit to survive, and those without that trait, and therefore they produced offspring with that trait, and those without the trait didn't survive. We're no longer in the survival of the fittest paradigm, because we do have resources to be compassionate. Survival of the fittest doesn't really work with us because it doesn't have to work. We have the resources. Humans are smart enough to improve their environment, to move to a more hospitable environment, produce more resources, or even change our environment to educate ourselves to become more fit to survive. That's how we compete. Humans are fundamentally exempt from the survival of the fittest, and we may not evolve anymore as a result of this, unless we are forced to evolve by changing our environment. For example, global warming may cause us to become amphibious again, for obvious reasons. We've all met some people who have evolved more than others, and some people who haven't evolved at all. And there are those who simply survive because of the compassion of others, because we have the resources to care for them, or even be amused by them. And some people survive simply because there are laws against killing them before they kill us. So evolution takes a lot of different forms. Take the guy who goes ice fishing on a frozen lake with his buddies to celebrate his new SUV with his golden retriever. And he throws a stick of dynamite out onto the lake to blow a hole in the ice, which is illegal. But his golden retriever, in a less than golden moment, retrieves the stick, comes back, blows himself up, blows up the owner, blows up his buddies, and sinks his brand new SUV to the bottom of Lake Erie. Now, he is the recipient of a Darwin Award, which is a book commemorating individuals who improve our gene pool by removing themselves from it in a sublime. If you don't kill yourself, you only get an honorable mention. You have to kill yourself before you reproduce, so that the genes are gone. Okay. Then there's the burglar. This happened last week. Burglar who breaks into a restaurant and he can't figure out how to use the lockpick, so he breaks through the door with a crowbar to surprise the people that are sitting at the counter drinking coffee at a 24-hour restaurant. So these people would not survive under the strictest Darwin rules if we did not have the resources to have tolerated them in the first place. We also have the resources to help others who are less fortunate, and even the criminally less fortunate. This is a great expense in terms of resources and tax dollars, but we can afford it more than if we were living under the strictest survival of the fittest. But we do still have the fittest survive, and we're an example of making ourselves more fit. With sufficient resources or the brains to expand those resources as necessary, survival of the fittest does not technically work for us, because it doesn't have to work. Face it, the problem is that evil wastes energy, like telling lies. You have to remember who you told what, when you told it to, and if you have both of them there, you have to put it all together and make a new story that fits both versions of your story. That's a lot of wasted energy. We're telling the truth is what? Simply a lot simpler, a lot better use of your resources. And that's our way of being more fit, and so the fittest will survive. And so yes, we want to live in a world ruled by Darwinism, because we have the brains to compete, against each other by increasing our resources instead of destroying the resources of others, because that way the fittest do survive.
To evaluate, we'll evaluate Charlie Lee. Help me welcome Deanne Gunneman.
Good morning, fellow Toastmasters. So to just speak in general on my observations of the speech, aside from Clay's visual part now, I did think it was effective to set the books up beforehand, because that got the audience already looking at that. It's just that it didn't go really beyond that, which is why I didn't meet the requirements. I felt you had a very good opening with how to positively compete. I thought that was very interesting and certainly enlightening in a much better way, I think, to look at things than the dog-eat-dog kind of aggressive competing. You had some great vocal variety and also word choices, some beautiful word choices. You talked about a pinnacle of the woodpile at one point. I thought that was very nicely done. You gave good fringe examples that weren't really on the Darwin, but that tied in some of your points. Overall, I felt that your focus was so broad that it's kind of like the icebreaker speech. You can't talk about your whole life. You've got to pick some parts of your life that you want to speak about. I think your speech would have been a little better served and a little easier to follow this morning if you would have picked a few of the trains of thought and developed those more fully, because there were times where I really kind of got lost where you were going with it. Even though you had so much information, good information, it was just a bit too much to stay focused on for me. Because of the use of notes, I would recommend having very large bullet points that are just enough to trigger and go. Because you had so much detail that there were times you got lost in the notes, and no need to apologize. We've all had that happen. So if it happens, you just, move on, go to the next thing, and you'll be fine. I felt that there was some good humor in the speech as well. I thought that the way you brought in 3 different aspects of the Darwin concept, including the humorous side, was effective. Just try to focus a bit more in the next speech so that we can follow along a little better. Thank you.